which is more serious, is that it's factually completely wrong. There's plenty of evidence, I won't mention it, for movement that yields no overt phenomenon associated with it. So it can't be right empirically. So it has two serious problems, and we ought to look for a different account. Actually, there is a way of thinking about it that may be right, that derives from one of the most interesting cases of movement that leaves no physical evidence behind. That's based on work by Howard Lasnik, mainly, a couple of others, on what used to be called raising to object. Has to do with sentences like, I expect John to be intelligent, where John semantically is, this belongs in the clause John intelligent, but it's possible to show that it actually appears in the higher clause, which doesn't make any semantic sense. And it gets there by a double movement operation, neither of which doesn't leave any effect, namely the downstairs subject, John, and I expected John to be intelligent. John moves over the verb, and then the verb moves up to the small v that heads the phase, and it leaves things looking exactly as they were. Well, that looked so crazy that for quite a few years I worked pretty hard trying to find counter evidence or some alternative analysis, and you can see the residue of this in various papers, but it didn't work. The evidence looks solid. So we're left with this extremely strange phenomenon. There's a whole variety of semantic and syntactic consequences to a movement that makes a double movement that makes no sense at all, because it leaves things exactly the way they started from the point of view of what you hear. Well, that remained as a paradox until it was noticed that you could get a solution to this problem if you assumed that the properties of the head of the phase, C and V, small v, were actually inherited by the element it selected. It would be tense and the verb in this case. I won't go through the details, but if you assume that, then these two movements take place, and you get the array of syntactic and semantic properties on the assumption of inheritance of the feature. Now, the inheritance itself was pretty weakly motivated. There was some motivation, but not much. However, it was pointed out by Mark Richards that the inheritance is actually entailed by the phase impenetrability condition, the condition on transfer of the interior. And that itself is very well motivated, conceptually and empirically. So in fact, I have a line of argument which goes from the empirical and computational motivation for the transfer operation, which yields as a consequence inheritance, which yields as a consequence this array of semantic and syntactic features, properties that seem to make no sense but are clearly there. Well, that's a good result, the kind of result you want. And if you make one more step, you generalize the inheritance of features to the question element, the Q that determines that a C is a question, not a declarative. If that too is inherited, then you get the vacuous movement hypothesis. You can think it through. I won't run through it, but in fact it's true. So without stipulating a new principle, which is furthermore wrong, you can get the vacuous movement hypothesis with all of its consequences, including the case I mentioned about the so-called ECP case, just on the basis of pure third factor properties. Well, again, that's the kind of result one wants. And I won't go on, but these are the sorts of directions that I think it would make sense to pursue, that is, chipping away as much as you can at stipulated properties of universal grammar, technologies that are proposed to deal with particular problems, try to see how closely you can show that language does approximate to the perfect design that it would be a rather natural expectation in the light of what appears to be its evolutionary history. Okay, thanks.
So we have time. We have time for just a couple questions. So let me just. Yes, there's a microphone up there.
Sequential and one-dimensional. What are your remarks and reflections on parallel grammars and multiple dimension grammars such as array grammars?
I couldn't hear. I'm sorry. Did you hear?
Carol, I believe the question is what. As I understand, your question is it has to do with parallel grammars.
Well, I mean, this is what I was describing is a parallel grammar. So when you do repeated construction of something by merge, it's all happening in parallel.
How about two-dimensional array grammars?
Two-dimensional?
Array grammars.
Yeah, I think there's good reason for thinking that, I didn't go into it, that there is at least two-dimensionality. This has to do with the nature of adjuncts as distinct from arguments. I think there's some evidence that they're actually in a third dimension. These are actually proposals that go back to ideas of Ken Sapphire and others back in the 80s, but I think you can get a better formulation of them, which would mean, if it's true, that there's actually two kinds of merge. One is just set merge, takes X and Y and forms the set XY, and the other, call it pair merge, takes X and Y and gives the pair XY, which builds in an asymmetry, and adjuncts have an asymmetry. So the adjunct phrase behaves like as if the adjunct wasn't there. It behaves like the thing to which it was adjoined to. And I think there's, it's complicated, but I think there's some evidence for that. However, any further complication that's introduced has to have empirical motivation. Okay? I mean, just, elementary methodological considerations. You pick the simplest possible theory unless you're shown that it's wrong because the facts are more complex.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I have to move on. Yes, Josh.
So could you comment on how the current guiding principle of perfection relates to the classical original idea of simplicity in the early days of generative grammar?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, the
question is how does unless Josh wants to use it, how does the notion of simplicity in the early days of generative grammar relate to this notion of perfection or perfectibility in the current sense?
Yeah.
Is that about it? Yeah.
Well, if you go back to the early days, say the 50s, there were two concepts of simplicity. One is just the general concept that holds for science altogether. And nobody can tell you what it is. But everyone working in the sciences uses it as a guiding principle. So you look for symmetries instead of asymmetries, and you try to have fewer principles instead of more principles, and so on. And there's all kind of work on this, like Hermann Weil's book on symmetry, and so on and so forth. But there's some kind of guiding principle that works in the sciences that's just accepted everywhere but never formulated, that says we're looking for the simplest possible solution. That's a general methodological principle. It's no more relevant to linguistics than to physics or history or anything else. That's one notion. A second notion was an internal notion of simplicity. Now that's an empirical assumption. Remember that in those days the assumption was that language acquisition is sort of what Charles Sanders Peirce called abduction. It's discovery of a theory on the basis of data. Now, it's perfectly well understood and has been, for hundreds of years, that there's no way to do this, that you can't do it by induction, and there's no generalizations and nothing else. It has to be something like what Peirce described, namely, there's got to be some built-in principles, we would now say genetically determined principles, that, in his words, limit available hypotheses. Okay, they just say, well, here's the only set of hypotheses you're allowed to look at. So it eliminates, huge masses of others. And that can guide inquiry in a particular direction. Now, Peirce was thinking about development of science. How do people discover quantum theory or something? But the same conception has to hold for acquisition of language if indeed language is a matter of theory language acquisition is a matter of theory construction. which it was assumed to be. And it's in this context that the internal notion of simplicity developed. It was called an evaluation measure. Can we find some measure that we can assign to the possible grammars, internal languages, that'll pick the best one? So there has to be some sharp limitation, Peircean-type limitation on the set of admissible grammars, but then you got to pick one. And inside that came the notion of simplicity, so that's where you get, notational devices like brackets and parentheses and, counting features and stuff like that. But notice that that's an empirical hypothesis. Okay, it says this is the way languages are picked. Okay, all that sort of went out the window when the principles and parameters approach was formulated back around 1980. This was a really sharp change in the way language was looked at. I mean, maybe it's wrong, but it looks right. In any event, it changed perspectives radically. It said there is no evaluation procedure and there's no abductive principle, and the child isn't discovering a theory. There are principles which are fixed, unchanged, and if the SMT is correct, may in fact follow from general natural law to a large extent. But there are principles that are fixed, and then there's a set of choices called parameters, and the child just has to find the values for the parameters. Well, there's going to be finitely many of these, so there'll be finitely many languages. And most of the work on language acquisition since then has been studying very productively what kind of data would allow a child to fix a parameter. And it turns out you can't do it one at a time, and a lot of complexities arise and so on. But with that approach, you eliminate the notion of evaluation procedure. And what we're left with is just the general notion of simplicity. All right, how does that relate to the present case? It's a sort of a way of trying to take the methodological principle of simplicity that's used for all inquiry and see if we can give it instead of an epistemological interpretation, give it a metaphysical interpretation. Say, okay, this is a real property of nature. Okay, it's not just some methodological principle we use, but it's a property of nature that it seeks computational efficiency. It's a natural law. If it is, it ought to show up in distribution of determining the neural wiring of a nematode, to pick one example where it seems to work. It should show up in foraging strategies for ants, let's say, and in all sorts of places. It should just be the way nature works. So it's a shift from viewing something as an epistemological principle of some vague kind to a metaphysical principle, if you like, something that's really true of nature, which you can then explore in many different ways. So to take a concrete example, it's always been assumed in the actual study of language that if you have redundancy in a system, there's probably something wrong. So, for example, Morris Halley's famous argument against phonemes back, it is almost 50 years ago, I guess, was based on the structuralist phonemes, on the observation that if you postulated this level, you had to duplicate rules, one in forming the level and one in mapping the level onto the next stage, and it was the same rules, so it was redundant. Well, just on epistemological grounds, that was taken, at least by sensible people like me, as a proof that the level doesn't exist. But you could reinterpret that as saying that's just not the way nature works. The way nature works is SMT and optimal neural wiring and so on and so forth. So and if you take it that way, it shifts from a methodological principle to an empirical principle that you can investigate. Like you could say, well, does nature really work this way? Let's try other cases. And that's a step forward. But that's the relation. SMT is an empirical hypothesis about the way nature works. Well, that remained as a paradox until it was noticed that you could get a solution to this problem if you assumed that the properties of the head of the phase, C and V, small v, were actually inherited by the element it selected. It would be tense and the verb in this case. I won't go through the details, but if you assume that, which is more serious, is that it's factually completely wrong. There's plenty of evidence, I won't mention it, for movement that yields no overt phenomenon associated with it. So it can't be right empirically. So it has two serious problems, and we ought to look for a different account. Actually, there is a way of thinking about it that may be right, that derives from one of the possible to show that it actually appears in the higher clause, which doesn't make any semantic sense. And it gets there by a double movement operation, neither of which doesn't leave any effect, namely the downstairs subject, John, and I expected John to be intelligent. John moves over the verb, and then the verb moves up to the small v that heads the phase, and it leaves things looking exactly as they were. Well, that looked so most interesting cases of movement that leaves no physical evidence behind. That's based on work by Howard Lasnik mainly, a couple of others, on what used to be called raising to object. Has to do with sentences like, I expect John to be intelligent, where John semantically belongs in the clause John intelligent, but it's crazy that for quite a few years I worked pretty hard trying to find counter evidence or some alternative analysis, and you can see the residue of this in various papers, but it didn't work. The evidence looks solid. So we're left with this extremely strange phenomenon. There's a whole variety of semantic and syntactic consequences to a movement that makes a double movement that makes no sense at all because it leaves things exactly the way they started from the point of view of what you hear.